so much, Gabrielle. And in fact, Anna Clark is going to be our main moderator. I'm just a co-host, so I will help her. And I want to usher in our main moderator, Anna Clark. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much, Nima. And well, I guess that's me on the spot then. So on behalf of IACD and the organisers, welcome everyone. I'd like to thank our workshop facilitators and really looking forward to this. I think that's Gabrielle, Mary, and is it John as well? Yep. We have until what time, Nima? We have about 70 minutes, is that right? Oh, she's frozen. I think we've got about 70 minutes for the workshop, so I'm sure we'll kind of be kept right, and I'll double check while you're in full swing. So I'm just going to hand over to yourselves. I'm sure it's a small group. It's one workshop. Over to you, folks.
Thanks so much, Anna and Nima, for hosting us today. I'm Dr. Gabrielle Donnelly, and I'm an associate professor at Acadia University. And so we actually have today joining with us, not only Doctors John Colton and Mary Sweetman, but Alicia Christie and Lisa McMinn. And when we were imagining this session around educating for compassionate communities in the context of community development, we thought, well, it's great that 3 faculty are getting together to talk about this, but actually we want to bring in student perspectives. And actually what we have today is incredible. We have Lisa McMinn with us as well, who's a current student, a dynamite student. And we also have Alicia Christie, who is a treasured alumni of our program and also a community partner working locally in Wolfville, where Acadia University is located. So today, and I'll just pull up, and we're so happy to have you all here. And sometimes, you know, small groups can be the most dynamic in terms of conversation. And so we're really happy to be here and to see all of you wherever you are coming in from the world. And we'll have an opportunity to just check in a little further along. But before I begin, before we get into things, just love to share with you a little bit about the purpose of what this session is about, what you're getting into. So the purpose really of today's session, and I think the title really indicates that, is to explore together ways of educating for compassionate communities of interdependence. And this really comes from some of the conversations we've had as faculty and with students in terms of how are we addressing or breaking down some of the kind of individualistic approaches to education that can exist, not only in North America, in Europe, but as they have been exported globally, these models of education. And how can we be, if we're bringing a community development lens, how can we bring what Parker Palmer and Arthur Zajonc talk about in The Heart of Higher Education, a transformation from independence to interdependence. And as I was listening to the opening sessions yesterday, and I was reminded of this concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, it feels incredibly timely and urgent and practical to be engaged in this kind of work. And so the other purpose of our session today is to really be sharing concrete ideas, examples, and methods that you can all integrate into your particular context, but then we also want to be learning from each of you in terms of what you're learning and seeing as well. And so I'll overview the agenda here in a moment, but in Canada, in the context of what is also known as Turtle Island, North America, we are regularly engaging, and particularly in the Canadian context, a practice called a land acknowledgement. And so this is a picture here of the Annapolis Valley, where Acadia University is located. And this was one of the iconic views of Cape Blomidon, and we can see the ocean. This is kind of the Bay of Fundy and the farmlands. And so this is kind of one of the iconic views where we live. And so we just wanted to offer you a window into our world. This is obviously a pretty picturesque day. It doesn't always look like this. We do have winter in Nova Scotia. But this is also just an opportunity for us to each take a moment to arrive in this session in whatever way feels great. So you might want to stretch or take some deep breaths or feel your feet on the ground, knowing that, you know, we're moving between sessions. We are, yeah, thank you. It is beautiful. That was one of my favorite views when I came to Nova Scotia. So just feeling your feet on the ground or taking some deep breaths, whatever versions of arriving work for you today. I know many of us are juggling work or families or just the challenges of joining from our homes, and then the excitement of what's happening in this conference. So whatever feels right to you to just arrive. For some of us, that might be closing extra browsers or turning off our phones. For others, you know, we might have to be on call in those ways. And so that's fine either way. And so part of this practice of land acknowledgement in Canada is to recognize the Indigenous peoples as part of the work of truth and reconciliation as we grapple with what it means to be a settler colonial state. And so we acknowledge that we live and work and engage in community development in the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Mi'kmaq. They've been in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki for over 10,000 years. And it's unceded and unsurrendered land. So choiceless from the perspective of the Mi'kmaq, and that we have, you know, that settler nations and people have moved in. And so we're in quite an incredible national time of working through and reconciling with the really hard truth of both our past and the kind of continued colonial violence of our present. And also, I want to just name that in Nova Scotia, we have over 40 communities of African descent, African Nova Scotians who have lived in communities in Nova Scotia for the past 400 years. And so Black Lives Matter and Black Futures Matter. And all of this work is very much at the heart of what we are grappling with in community development in our context. And it is both challenging and deeply nourishing simultaneously. And so I invite you to just briefly visualize the land that you are on and the original peoples of that land. It may be you, it may be people that you live among. Just a moment of acknowledging. And then I invite you, as that kind of just fades past on the picture image, I invite you to just bring to mind some images of Kenya. There was this incredible video showing the land and the people and the languages. And so just kind of bring that to mind for a moment. And knowing that land is what connects us across these virtual landscapes, and that Kenya is the place that's hosting us and holding us, even as we meet virtually online. So here's what we're up to today, our agenda. So we've welcomes and introductions and purpose so far, a land acknowledgement practice. We want to check in, we want to hear from you a little bit, and then we're going to go into a bit of context and foundational concepts. So we'll be hearing from John and then Mary, kind of situating us in the context of the program that we want to be sharing stories and learning from, and then some of the foundational concepts that are informing how we're thinking about things. And then, of course, we've invited Lisa and Alicia to join us. And so we wanted to have a bit of a short panel conversation around the question, what are we learning about cultivating compassionate communities of interdependence? And where's the grittiness in that? Where's the challenge in that as well? And then we want to engage all of you to hear what you're learning, to engage your questions, to talk about practical ways that we can integrate things into our own context, and then we'll wrap up and close at the 70-minute mark. Sound good as a process? So the invitation to participate today, and it's really lovely to see cameras on. So this is in the workshop format, right? So in this sense where we have thought through participatory processes, ways of engaging. And so we invite you to show up in that in whatever ways feel comfortable to you or you have bandwidth for today. We love having an active chat. So thank you already for chiming in there with the chat. If you're able to have your cameras on, that's great. And we also recognize Zoom fatigue is real. So if you need to have your cameras off today, that's okay. And we've just noticed that, you know, the more we see faces, the more dynamic and engaged and excited all of us are. So that's just part of the mix as we make those decisions. I'll be able to respond to the chat as we go, and we can certainly integrate those pieces into conversation. We invite you to bring your insights and make any connections between other sessions in the conference, your expertise, your research, your lived experience, your community-based experience. So all of that's invited today. And I recognize that this is a session that is in English, just by virtue of us as a group that's leading and hosting you. But we are a global audience, and so recognizing that English may be an additional language for some, we will work to speak slowly and clearly, and also invite you to remind us in the chat if things are moving too quickly. Also the Canadian accents, recognizing all of the various elements in that. And then finally, I would just say that one of the principles as a facilitator I love to bring is to think about how we both take space and make space. And this is not just for all of you as participants, but also for us as a group bringing some ideas to you, because power shows up in all spaces. And tending to those power dynamics and being aware of them is an important part of how I work, and I think how community development works, but what the practices of that look like at a micro level. And so the invitation is for all of us to be attending to that. So thinking about how we both take space, but how we also make it for others, recognizing when we're working cross-culturally that the length of pauses between comments might feel quite different culturally, the ways that we either interject or don't, who feels comfortable speaking, all of those things. So the invitation for us is just to notice these things and play with them, and care for each other in it. So let's begin with we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you as participants. And so I'm going to throw into the chat here I've seen that some of the other sessions have used this. It's not very challenging, a Mentimeter link. And let me just find the chat box. Here it is. So if everybody, including our contributors today, wants to head over to the Menti link here, we have a couple of questions for you. And the first one is, where in the world are you joining from today? So if you follow that link, you should be able to type in quite quickly, where are you joining from today? If anybody's having trouble accessing that link, just let me know. Okay, we have Dundee, Scotland, Norfolk, UK, Nova Scotia, Wolfville. Ooh, that is in Irish or Gaelic. Please, if you would like to pronounce it, please do.
It's actually the anglicized, it's Maharafelt.
Maharafelt.
Yeah.
North of Ireland. Thank you,
Yeah.
Anna. Gasparo, wonderful. Okay, the next question. Oh yes, and Nairobi. Of course, I'm so glad we have a Nairobi participant. And so the next question just is, what time of day is it for you? You're up earlier than usual. It's morning and you're feeling fresh, close to midday meal, time for an afternoon nap. It's evening where I am, or past my usual bedtime. That was for all of the potential Australia, New Zealand folks. Yeah, so we have a couple of people who are headed into the lower energy part of the day. We have someone who's in the evening, a couple of people who've either eaten recently at the middle of the day or are thinking about lunch. And then of course we've got a bunch of us who are it's definitely earlier than most of the sessions in our lives, except for the occasional university admin meeting that can't happen at any other time but 8:30 in the morning. Okay, and then the final question is, what drew you to this session in particular? Why are you here? Why did you show up? Out of all of the choices you could have made, what drew you to this session? And I know some of you are also here for support reasons from a conference perspective. So answer that however you'd like. So the opportunity to connect, share, and hear from one another, to hear what is new and currently happening at the Community Development Program at Acadia, collaborate with colleagues, association of compassion with community development, education, and training, to share and contribute to the session as a student. I'm teaching community development and I thought I might learn something. The word compassion stood out to me, and I think this can be lost in some of our work, and thought it was positive that it was being focused on. I do not know what these three words mean together, but I like them separately: community, compassion, interdependence. Interested in learning how other communities of learners engage in transformative practice compassionately. Great, well now I'm just so excited that you're all here, because these are the kinds of conversations and explorations I know that I want to be in, and that all of us want to be in as well with you. So next we have, John is going to provide us with just a little context and overview of the program, and I'll put the slide up here in a minute, followed by Mary just helping us potentially break down some of those concepts, in distinct ways as we think about what they look like as we integrate them. So.
Thanks, Gabriel. And good morning, everyone. And as Gabriel said, she showed you, when she was discussing the land acknowledgement, she showed you kind of a picture of the area where our university is located. And this is another image which captures the university town. And it's a fairly small town. And as Gabriel noted, I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about our program. And she used the word grappling, and we are grappling with those issues, and I'll highlight that again, and then Mary will more closely situate the context of our discussion later this morning. So I'm very fortunate to be sharing this time with all of you, in particular my colleagues Mary and Gabriel, and our two students Lisa and Alicia. What often it's interesting, we're talking about interdependence, but what happens in universities, we're very we're very siloed, but even with our own programs, even in a community development program, we're often siloed, interestingly enough. And so it's a great opportunity to, within our own program, to kind of move beyond those silos. So this is why it's a great opportunity to work with the four others in this collaborative workshop. But one thing I do know, which I'm very grateful for, is that folks that I work with in this program are very much engaged in community development work across a variety of spectrums, and we've come to use this word scholar practitioners, and that was a very intentional use of language, because for those of you who are associated with work at universities and the way we move through promotion and tenure, we use these traditional terms, and we've really tried to break down, even within our own university, how we're evaluated for our work, because we tend to contribute to theory, but we also do that while we're contributing to communities, often simultaneously. And the lines are often blurred between the work that we do with respect to research and teaching and service. So that, applied scholar practitioners is very important. And we do emphasize the scholarly side of it. And because sometimes if you just only use the word applied scholars, then it doesn't necessarily imply that you're building on knowledge and sharing knowledge. And so, that's how we position ourselves in our program. We're a 4-year degree program, very, very small graduate program. And, we really emphasize the notion of building a community within our program. And, why we host many experiences. Some of this will probably come up later in the talk, but we host experiences where, in addition to what we might learn in the class, we also will spend time socially with our students, engaged in a variety of activities, but with the significant focus, certainly in our classrooms, of applied learning. So deep partnerships with communities, deep partnerships with organizations, and we find that and this is something that we're continuing to, I wouldn't say grapples quite the word with this. We've been using this word scaffolding, meaning that our programs from 1st to 4th year really build meaningfully on each other in terms of how we introduce our students to community and the profession, but where do they go in their 4th year and final year? And so, the two programs, that are, I guess, centerpieces, or we might say benchmarks or bookends of the program, would be our 1st year experience, where we bring our students together, we partner with our community, our students interview numerous stakeholder groups within the community, and then they share that through an overnight experience, through presentations that are done creatively. At the same time, they're building relationships with each other. And later, many of these students will then share the insights that they've learned in these different communities that we partner with, that might be looking at things like what makes it a good community to live, what makes it a happy community, happiness. There's a number of different ways of framing communities. There's the happiness indexes, et cetera. So sometimes we look at various frameworks, and then we explore that meaningfully in communities, looking at what makes it a good place to live and what changes might occur to make it a more deeply meaningful place to live, and how might others get involved and connect within that community. So our students are embedded in that in their very first year in the program. But by the time, through other experience through 2nd and 3rd year, that's bookend once again to what we call our core term 4th year experience with intense 2-week block courses, professional placements in organizations, and then a full-time 3-week community development experience where they're offering professional support for a range of different types of initiatives, whether it's youth engagement strategies and strategic planning. And so that's just sort of a highlight of our program. And of course, you can find more and learn more about it if you wish to. Gabriel mentioned this idea of grappling with some pretty key issues that have been front and center across North America and across many parts of the world, but certainly for ourselves. And one thing I value deeply among my colleagues is the fact that we do spend time not just thinking about these issues, but sort of critically reflecting on our place in the university and our role as educators with respect to equity and social justice. So Gabriel noted there's many initiatives that were brought to the forefront by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's also been in the news, the horrific news about, which made front page of, the BBC news services in the last weeks of the range of children buried in residential schools that were for Indigenous children. And so, there's been a number of, events that have happened historically, obviously, but very recently as well, that really emphasizes the importance to address issues with respect to decolonization. And how do we address that as a program? As you can see, the four presenters in this group don't necessarily represent the diversity of Canada or Nova Scotia, or even in some respects, the university, where predominantly and historically, Acadia University has been a university for, fairly, privileged individuals, and that's, our demographics are certainly changing. And so we're working within our own faculty of how do we address those issues? How do we bring in that diversity, and how do we do it? And interestingly enough, as our university goes through strategic planning, how do we do it in a way that's deeply meaningful? That's not just about adding color. How do we do it in a way that's deeply meaningful, embedded in our values? And so, Black Lives Matter, as I said, decolonization are issues that we grapple with. We spend time working to develop relationships, and we're spending time with faculty and faculty unions and administrative groups trying to figure out how we can do what are called either focused or designated hires, and how do we recognize and value community experience, which is not normally something that can be reflected in our normal, ways of evaluating faculty. And then finally, environmental justice is a strong core part of our program. And of course, we're grappling with that. Our students are grappling with ecological grief, terms that have been relatively new to me as a faculty person just in the last few years. And it's students that are bringing that to light for many of us. And of course, a great deal of focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. So, it's not supposed to be easy work, and we'll probably get into things later today that talk about our edges and what takes us to these comfort zones, and it's these areas and more that are putting us in this area of stretching our sort of our zones of comfort, and it's how do we move through those zones, and how do we support one another, and how do we learn about how to address these issues meaningfully and deeply in our program. So I'll pass it to Mary.
Thanks, John. I'm going to just really briefly talk about some overarching concepts to get us started into discussion. And I think what will happen is, as we do sort of a demo panel of discussion, some of these concepts will come out even more, but just to ground us in some of the ideas that we put forth and even our title. And I loved that comment that someone made around, like, I really like all three of these, but I'm not sure how they're interconnected around compassion, community, and interdependence. So I'm going to just try my best at this moment to break those down and to think about them with us, and then we'll go into some deeper discussions together. So when I've been studying and thinking about interdependence, it often starts with how we grow as an individual, as a learner, moving from a state of dependence to independence to interdependence. And post-secondary scholars suggest that post-secondary education is a place for interdependence. And so in Western university systems, we've often focused on independence as the goal of an education of post-secondary. And what we're looking at now is that maybe that is not helpful to educate people as individuals going off to pursue individualistic type pursuits, and that we would be far better served if we were able to teach an interdependent or community of practice or community of learners. And I like to think about this too around an analogy of our systems or our ecosystems, in that when we just focus on one species within an ecosystem and concentrate we don't see the interconnections, or we often fail to help the whole ecosystem survive. When we add in an invasive species to control another species, it often has negative impacts on other components of the ecosystem, and inevitably it fails. We can think about it too as the human body, is that when we have an ailment in one piece of us, it often has compounding impacts on other parts of us, and that we are holistic beings. We live in a holistic communities. And so if we're able to if we can step back and we can have that global view, if we can look at the globe, those beautiful pictures of our Earth as a system, and we see it as a system, then perhaps we'll be able to educate in these messy ways. And so as learners, we move through a dependence, and usually it's a dependence on whether it's educators, parents, coaches in those early forms of early education for young people, through to independence and learning how to care for ourselves, into interdependence. And we can think of those as ecological or systems ways of thinking, part of a whole, that community, and a collaborative practice. And often in community development, we talk about a collaborative practice. And in post-secondary, the scholars are moving also to thinking about the common good, or responsibilities for one another, all beings, so not to the human being, but to all beings within our community. So that's sort of the unpacking of interdependence and what we mean around that when we're speaking of education. And the other way that I like to think about it too is that an interdependent education does not just focus on the head. It focuses on educating the head, the heart, and the hands. And that if we are just educating conceptually, intellectually, then we're missing a fairly big component of how we can integrate more authentically and holistically, and that we shouldn't shy away in post-secondary education from teaching emotion and from grappling with compassion and empathy and care. And this is something that we talk a lot about in our program in community development, is how do you do that? How do you engage with students in those compassionate ways around teaching compassion? How do you model compassion? How do you learn on that edge of compassionate education? So that's the other kind of component there, is that if we're going to ask students to learn in these messy ways, we also have to be willing to do that. And that requires compassion and empathy and care. And there's a new path that's really fascinating, I think, around care pedagogy and how to integrate care into our practices. And I think the other concept that I just want to touch on briefly is transformation and transformative education, and understand that as educating the whole person by integrating the inner life and the outer life. So integrating that holistic idea of the human, that we are teaching whole people by actualizing individual and global awakening, and by practicing in compassionate communities. And that also comes from Parker Palmer, who writes a lot about post-secondary education and teaching the whole being. So those are just some of the concepts, and transformative learning is something that we talk about quite a bit in community development. And that's when we help students engage in a disorienting dilemma, is kind of what Mesereau would call it, but in a really uncomfortable place. But then doing that in such a way that allows the student or the educator to do so in a reflective way, whether it's reflecting with oneself, with dialogue with other folks, in order to transform or to be more open to ideas and to situating themselves in new ways of learning. So these are multiple concepts that we grapple with as educators, but we also see them in community, so that when we invite our students, or when our students go through a 4-year program, that when they land in community, university represented community. So I think we're doing a disservice to our students by not engaging in these sort of hard concepts or transformative education or teaching interdependently, because our education systems must reflect the complexity of our actual communities. So I will leave it there, unless there's any questions that people want to throw into the chat or ask. If you want more context or theoretical sort of framing, it's not very, but I think we might also come to those things as we talk. But is that helpful? I guess my question is if that's helpful around kind of understanding those three ideas as we jump into conversation.
We've got a little confirmation there in the chat, Mary. And so, yeah, great. Thanks, Anna, for the thumbs up. And please feel free to throw questions in as we go, because our panelists, this kind of conversation piece that we have next before we move into more of the engagement piece with all of you directly, please feel free to just be active in the chat and people can feed it into their responses. I think what I was just noticing so thank you, John and Mary, for those pieces. And as I was listening to you, Mary, I was just thinking about, yes, it's like, these are so many of the reasons I'm a scholar. Like, I love the world of ideas that can orient us in ways forward that feel open and fresh and full of possibility. And then what's the lived practicalities on the ground? And this is the tension of the scholar practitioner, right? In so many ways. And so I think that's what we get to invite now in this conversation that we move into with Alicia and Lisa and John and Mary, with me hosting. And we'll do this for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll kind of move into a more open format for all of us to dig in together, but just a little more to kind of ground us in the what's this like on the ground? What's the experience of it? And thank you. Oh, great. Some resources in the chat. So I'm going to ask Alicia first and then Lisa to respond to the question from your perspectives as a current student, as alumni, as a community partner. What does cultivating compassionate communities in education or educating for compassionate communities look like to you? What does it mean to you? And Alicia and then Lisa.
Thanks so much for the question, Gabe, and good morning on our end to everyone as well. Yeah, and it's so great to see an active chat, so thanks again for that. Yeah, in response to your question, and in thinking about it, I feel like a lot of what building a compassionate community, whether it's in an education system or program, or as an active community member yourself, is deeply rooted in empathy and how we're seeing the folks we're communicating with, and recognizing, if I think to a student community member perspective, acknowledging that as a student, you have a lot to learn from a community member, and hopefully they're also open enough to perhaps learn from you. Yeah, so I think in building that and acting with empathy, we create opportunity for that more transformative learning experience that may involve the head, the heart, the hands that Mary was speaking to. So yeah, I think it's deeply rooted in our approach and how we approach and communicate with one another in these processes. And I can hand it to Lisa.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with all of you. I would say, kind of reflecting on that question, Gabrielle, to probably bring it back to that interconnectedness that Mary was talking about through community. And I feel that compassionate communities can only be built, as Alicia said, with empathy and building that interconnectedness, whether that's in the classroom, in the community, or as a whole. And again, with those practices of, teaching the head, the heart, and the hands, I really like that, Mary. And just having a community that is open and that is welcoming with compassion. And I think that is the way to kind of build, I guess, that community interconnectedness while having a lens of empathy and kind of caring within that. So I will hand it back to Gabrielle.
Thank you. And so from the educator perspective, Mary and then John, what does supporting in practice in the classroom, in the real world, or in the work of community work, what does supporting this cultivation of compassionate communities in education or in community development mean to you?
Yeah, I think something that I've learned over the years is how to be vulnerable, or how important it is to be vulnerable, but how challenging that is as an educator. And part of that is having a really reflective practice, which means being in dialogue with my colleagues, but also with my students around how something landed with them, or what they're taking away, being open to feedback. And so I think it takes a lot of humility around creating the spaces for this type of learning. And it's hard work. I'm definitely not perfect at it, or even close to. And I think those are some of the pieces around having reflective practice, being open to feedback and assessment all along the way, asking students and colleagues how I'm doing, or how we could be improving. And I think recognizing that teaching is not a solo act. So I might have the position of power and authority in the classroom, because that's how we have set up our colonial westernized post-secondary institutions, as having this person at the front, but trying to really break that down. So sitting in circle, thinking even of the environment around how do you create community, asking people like Alicia to come into class, or joining her in community, so that we can really grapple with what is actually happening in community. So trying to break down the institutional walls or barriers that we create in higher education. So I think those are some of the ways in which I grapple with and try. And Alicia and Lisa have had me as educators, and so for sure they'd probably have some reflective ideas around that too, around how I could improve, or that we've had those conversations as well around how to do that work more authentically. So yeah, so I think it's reflective practice, and not thinking that you're alone, or that it's a solo act, that you see yourself as a learner. I think those are some of I guess the other one, too, is also being open to transformation. So not seeing myself as someone, as moving through those hard times with my students, being open to disorientation and those dilemmas, and then engaging in dialogue around how to transform. And certainly over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of opportunity for that, as we try as an institution to decolonize and indigenize. Maybe John, I'll pass it over to you, and then you can,
Sure.
I'll keep thinking.
Yeah, no, thanks. And it's interesting. I came into the university today so I could have better access to the internet, and I keep getting booted off because our things aren't so great here. I said earlier, one thing that's been really nice about this is that I haven't, it's a chance for us to deeply engage in this conversation, when the fact that we're putting some thought into this. And I've been doing teaching for about 25 years, and in courses like tourism, and more lately things around energy and marine energy, and so where does this idea of care and empathy and compassion and the heart, head, and hands sometimes seemingly fit into those courses? And of course they fit into those courses, but honestly, it's not something that I deeply reflected on for 5 and 10 years. I mean, I think sometimes if you try to be a caring or kind person, maybe you feel that sort of covers your bases, but that only goes so far. That's, individual interaction, being able to care and be kind, and show that and receive that, I guess. But that's very different than developing sort of reflective, compassionate learners and empathy. And I was listening to a podcast of all things this weekend, and the speaker said empathy is compassion without judgment. And it just made me think about that. And our students and all of us come to a place that's been so framed by our education and our experience and society and our peer groups. And then we come together in this community development program. And what we want is to develop this idea of compassion for others, this idea of service to others, to empower others. And so how do we kind of address and break down our own stereotypes and the way we judge? And I even hear it, in my son, who unintentionally uses a word, like sketchy. And I'm like, well, what does sketchy mean? He said, well, I said, can you actually explain what that term means? And I said, oh, it's just a term that I've been hearing that for years among young children. But I said, well, what does it mean to be sketchy? And then we kind of and this is a 22-year-old young man who kind of been doing this with his colleagues, peers, since he's just a young boy. And I'm like, Keeter, like, let's break that down. Like, what does that actually mean when you use that term? I said, I know you think you don't mean anything by it, but there's some sort of judgment in there. And so, as a parent, I was probably putting, we were both on our edges, and then, with my students, what I'm finding lately is that they're putting me on my edge more so than I'm probably putting them on their edge. And that's one thing that I'm taking in from my colleagues, is how do I work towards, putting them on their edge, and this idea of really integrating what Mary was saying, this pedagogy of care. And so, as thanks, Mary. I'm going to consider this more through our conversation today, and I've obviously been thinking about this a lot lately, and I'm just kind of owning up to the fact that I've never been put in the position of having to think deeply about these issues until probably in the last 2 years, and so I'm still grappling with it. And going back to what I said earlier, I work to be a kind and caring person, but that's very different than sort of this idea of care pedagogy. That probably helps, but how do we help create that and foster that in others? Anyways, I'll pass it back to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, all of you, for that response. And so I'm looking at time. So what we're going to do is one more round of questions. And then I think, Jennifer, you've written something here in the chat. This is really interesting when speaking about the formal constructs of educational settings. I'm not a tutor. I support local groups to create change and empower communities, and I'm still resonating with this. Those people that I work with often don't recognize themselves as learning or developing unless it happens within a formal setting and training courses. It's very difficult sometimes to create recognition for this learning that have been accomplished without being patronizing. Encourage the recognition of the process or journey for creating changes rather than the quick fix solutions that many are working towards. Yeah, thank you for that, Jennifer. I mean, I think, and there's something about, as I was listening to all of these responses, there's something about slowing down to appreciate all that's happening in the in-between spaces, not just the formally recognized spaces. So thanks for feeding that in. So we'll have one more round of questions to the four of you, and then we'll move into opening up this dialogue further with everyone else. And again, please keep popping things into the chat or responding to each other in the chat. That feels great. It's possible to have multiple conversations happening in the same space at the same time. So the question that I'd love to ask you all is, from your various vantage points, community partner, alumni, student, professor, community development practitioner, how do you engage with your learning edge around this? Like, we've talked about kind of what it, what does it feel like, or what does it mean to us? But like, then what's that learning edge feel like? When does it work? And what does being pushed too far feels like? And what does it feel like when the group is pushed too far, that community of students, or that in the community context, when you've pushed too far? So what does that learning edge feel like for you? When does it work? And what does being pushed too far feel like? And we'll go Lisa, Mary, Alicia, and then John.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I think for me as a student, my learning edge is mainly determined by kind of conversation and discussion and new experiences. I think in terms of conversation, you know, having a different or a difficult conversation within a classroom setting, I think that it can be great to be on that learning edge without being pushed too far when the conversation and support is provided as we're discussing kind of a difficult topic or a newly introduced topic. But I think that that learning edge is pushed too far kind of as a group when you know, we don't have that conversation to the extent that maybe it could have been, and then students leave the class with kind of this unfinished conversation that they've been having, and it could have been, you know, they could have been diving very deep into that topic and not had a chance to fully, I guess, again, using that word, fully grapple with the topic in terms of, you know, kind of self-reflection and how the student is in terms of that work. In terms of experiences, I think kind of for me, any new experience is a learning edge, just because I'm constantly learning and growing as a student. But, you know, things like the first year experience, that was definitely a learning edge for me at the time. I hadn't experienced anything like it, but it was great to be surrounded by, you know, all these great students and these great faculty. And I think that was a perfect learning edge, you know, since we were surrounded by that support within the group. But within the program, I think it's so important to come to that learning edge and have that support from other students and faculty while we're continuing to learn and grow.
Thanks, Lisa, Mary, and then Alicia.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I'm thinking about those are my edges too. And I know I've facilitated a conversation and all of a sudden it's like everyone has to go because we're restricted to a time frame, and knowing that we haven't finished something really important, or that I'm leaving students not that it's resolution is important, but that you're, you know, leaving with some, not everyone has had a chance to say something or to come to that. And so as a educator, educating outside of the classroom, so being available to students and to community partners outside of my, you know, office hours or whatever you call those times. I think my own learning, I think I'm always on my learning edge sometimes. Like, I think that's my reality as I continually learn and move through being an educator. I think some of my learning edges are when I integrate action research into my teaching, and so getting students out into community, and wearing multiple hats as an educator, which I try to do to integrate experiential education as much as possible in the class, but it is really challenging. And you know, so making sure that my community partner is ready for that integration with students, making sure the students are ready, and making sure that the university is ready, and that it has not always been successful, and to recognize that, and to engage in reflective practice around that. So I think those are some, I don't know if that answers, I'm thinking around the learning edge. And I think one of the ways that I've really started, I think as a program we really think about, is balancing the open-endedness of my education or my classroom or the learning or the community engagement, being like, yeah, it could go in a lot of different directions, but also helping students not meander too much or get lost, or so then it's balancing it with also having the tools and the skills and the abilities in those discomforts or in that meandering. And I find that really hard. So I think that's those learning edges around making sure students are prepared enough for the engagement, but then also allowing lots of space and room for growth and for going a different direction. So being open to that. I think that's where I'll stop.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mary. Regarding learning edge, I feel like there's two versions of this for myself, my learning edge as a student and a learning edge as now community practitioner alumni, if you will. But yeah, to speak to it as a student, I think my learning edge came up in two ways during the degree. One of which being that community development was inherently designed to be interdisciplinary. So as students, when we sat in a business classroom with not our community development professors, we were able to take knowledge from other classes and apply it to more traditional perspectives in other disciplinaries, which was really interesting to push yourself that way. And sometimes those business professors looking to you to bring a community development lens in, and you're not an expert yet, so you're put on the spot. But that was a learning edge there. And also completing my research for my honors and having a professor who was really willing for flexibility and gave me room to make mistakes. That was a great space to be on my learning edge as well, of taking this path and learning that that path wasn't the best route. Let's walk backwards and reroute. That was a learning edge for me as a student. And now as a practitioner, it's like I'm holding these theories and these ideas and learnings from the degree, but trying to apply them in a world full of red tape and bureaucratic practices and filing and documenting everything you do and doing all the finance side of it. So that learning edge is coming to, okay, here's this knowledge, but here's this wall. And how do we take this and try to push it past this, and recognizing that action can't be done alone. So how do we incorporate other individual knowledge and bring in that idea of interdependence in the workforce when we choose to operate as interdependent beings as well, and not siloed? Perhaps we can all come to our learning edge a bit more and learn from one another and keep pushing things forward. So my learning edge has shifted, but it's really neat to think of it in both ways. So thanks for that question.
Thanks, Alicia. And it's interesting having Alicia on here because, Alicia, a couple of years ago, when she was a student for one of her final projects, developed a manual for one of our first year experiences in the environmental studies program. And I actually scanned it this morning. I came into my office earlier because we want to take the work that she did and be able to, have a model. So we're not reinventing the wheel every time we do these experiences. And when I was thinking about my learning edge, I was thinking about this word being vulnerable for myself. And I know what it feels like to honestly feel kind of vulnerable, a little anxious, and it's very safe and comfortable for me to, prepare the stuff that I've prepared, and things that I've taught with updates here and, along the way. But I know the difference between being there and being vulnerable. And I just want to give you just a little example. I'm going back to this environmental studies first year student camp. And what made me think about it again is Alicia did the manual for it as a final project, which I copied this morning and shared with other faculty. But we do something called an endangered species rendezvous. And it's where, and we've been so blessed to have another faculty member who recently retired, who's been very good at putting people of all ages across all demographics on their learning edge, Alan Warner. And so in this endangered species rendezvous, he gets faculty members like myself to maybe climb up in a tree and pretend I'm a peregrine falcon at night, with students walking in and sort of chirping and then talking about what it's like, with the impacts of DDT and loss of habitat. So here I am, 25 years teaching, and I'm up in a tree and I'm in a cloak pretending to be another character. But it puts all of us on our learning edge because it's, the students are coming in, to these experiences, faculty are coming into these experiences, and I guess we're allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. So moving away from a very specific experience, I think it's allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, but it's also having that conversation, prior to that, and to be open and honest and transparent, where, we kind of lay it on the line, sort of, a caring, kind, professional way. And that helps work towards, I guess, potentially might be, we're using the word safe environments to explore sometimes very challenging issues, among many people. It helps sometimes set the tone for our interactions with classes or with communities about, having sort of, I guess I would say, good, honest conversations around, what does it mean to reach these goals, and what is it, if we discuss the word vulnerable or care, what do we mean by that, and how can we leave ourselves open to that vulnerability, but at the same time make sure that we're moving through that in a way that's safe. And I always want to, that's always a really fine line, or that razor's edge, because that's really come up a lot these days about creating a safe environment for, we don't want to make sure we don't trigger students. And so there's a lot of navigating that I think we're all learning how to do better and more effectively. Anyways, that's how I've been kind of thinking about it lately. So Gabriel, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for seeding some of these pieces. I mean, we have conversations happening in the chat, and so now it's an opportunity for us to all be in conversation together. And I'd really say we're not so much interested in a question and answer or question and response. Although if you do have a particular question that you would love to ask a particular person, please do. You can pull something from the chat. You can also share if you feel like it. What's your learning edge around any of these elements? Compassion, communities, interdependence. What questions are you pondering or holding? And is there an idea that sparked something that you want to engage further, whether it's conversations coming up in the chat or something that's been sparked in this conversation? And again, you're welcome to unmute or put your hand up, or even just type into the chat. But let's use this opportunity to go further in the ways that Lisa, sometimes grieves we don't have the opportunity to do. Jennifer contributes, I would say that we have lost the opportunities for sharing vulnerability within this pandemic, and it has caused some real tension and difficult relationships between many in our community. Hopefully, space for conversation, compassion, and empathy can lead to more recognition of interdependency can open up here soon. Thank you for bringing that in and just anchoring us in the kind of the present, right? The really immediate context of the ramifications of how things have played out in the pandemic. So anyone, if you want to pick that piece up or contribute something else, we can be in conversation together.
Sorry, I'll speak rather than chatting this time.
Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to share. I had a conversation with one of our community members actually this afternoon on the lunch break, as they tend to do. And he was telling me how he'd gone to a local pub after work and was speaking to some of the gentlemen in there. And this group run a community centre. They're like a charity group of volunteers that create a programme, and they've kind of lost their way through the pandemic. It's been closed and there's not been a lot that they've been able to do. Many of them are older, so even that, the digital barrier was there. And he was speaking about, he'd gone into this pub and he was speaking to a gentleman. They've been planning a digital skills workshop type thing for older people, and he was just telling me that he spoke to this man who was really interested in it. And I thought, that's something that hasn't been able to happen this year. You haven't been able to just go and speak to someone and find out what's happening in their life and how could it be helped because of the pandemic. And I thought that's something that he wouldn't recognise because he's not a student or a community development, learning and development sort of minded person. He's on this group and he does a job and he sees it as a job. And he's done it well, and it's how do you recognize these little, he doesn't see that as a big deal, and I'm like, that's huge, there's people coming back together again. But he's not. It's how do you recognize that without being patronizing to a 70-year-old man that just thinks he's had a conversation in a pub without saying that's amazing. It's so difficult, but it was just such a positive thing. I just wanted to share that. Sorry.
Thanks, Jennifer. It also reminds me of people who are, starting to think about how are we intentionally celebrating the ways that we are coming back together, but also the recognition within that of the potential discomfort in it of being unpracticed. Anna.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, so this is actually, these topics are not, let's say, in my narrowest field of interest, but when you were discussing, and particularly when your students were reflecting, and thank you for doing this, I remembered my students in this past year and a half that had really tremendously difficult years. So except of the online and the pandemic, they experienced 2 earthquakes, quite a significant one. And then 2 months ago, they were also exposed to the community of hate, I would say, because we had a really one tragic event in Croatia regarding the death of one young girl due to family violence. And of course, there was really tremendous community of hate towards social workers, and my students are social workers. And in all this year and a half, with all these tragic events that they experienced, they were so alone. And you know, we occasionally communicated, of course, with them through their working assignments and everything. And eventually one student said, please get online, join our Facebook groups, react, because we are under attack. And this is, they wanted us as their teachers, and they wanted us to get involved somehow, because we couldn't reach them, we couldn't communicate with them, we couldn't share all the things that we would usually share in the hallways, in the cafeteria, or sometimes between the classes. So now I'm so yeah, I'm happy to see your students, and when they really asked us, please join the Facebook groups, and we said, like, this is not our comfort zone. It's not you know, talking online in Facebook groups and dealing with the trolls. It's not the things that we are comfortable doing it is. But they say, yeah, we need you even there in the, like, some kind of battlefield. So yeah, it was really challenging year, and it made me just thinking about all the things that you said, and how this interaction and this human touch and this genuine conversation with the students is really inevitable part of the learning process. So yeah, just a short reflection that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. And just curious, Anna, if you'd be willing to share a bit more, what have you learned from this year going through all of that you will take forward into your teaching and relationship with students that's new?
Yeah, I feel like when I started teaching 11 years ago, then I was I would say that I was both process and content oriented. But then during times, you know, when you get some kind of routine, then you maybe.
Oh, you muted yourself there just a few seconds ago.
Okay. So I don't know, I think we have a quite big number of students in my year, but I would definitely want to reorganize the classes so that I can have a much more in-depth conversation with them, and just giving and maybe receiving some more reflections from them. And I also believe that they expect more of my personal reflection. So they expect to see how I and my colleagues, how are we personally dealing with something. So I think that I'm not sure what our next academic year will look like. Are we going online or not? So, and this insecurity is also a big challenge. But I would definitely want to, yeah, make more space for this real contact, I would say, if it's just maybe less content and more contact.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that lesson learned with us. Anna Clark.
Thank you. And thank you, Anna, for sharing what you did as well. I think that the more we get into the conference and the more we get into the circumstances over the last 18 months to 2 years, the more familiar so many of these conversations are, for me anyway. I find myself more and more in them, which is really good. And so I wanted to thank you for your workshop today, and for the kind of the honesty underpinning it as well, in terms of the authentic way in which we are all individual human beings, no matter what hats we might be wearing. I think that shapes and informs so much of how we respond to the environment around us. A lot of what we've been talking about connects with other conversations, as I said, and one of those is a set of workshops I've been running with a couple of colleagues, aptly called Answers from the Edge, which was very much about learning from those peripheral experiences that we have, and that it is easy to kind of stay on the familiar path, but it is once we kind of go to the outer edges of our experiences and explore them and share them, and unpick them, that sometimes we can get, if not answers, then definitely insights. And part of that, I think, is to some extent what I've taken from Anna's contribution there as well, that we don't necessarily all have answers, no matter what professional hats we might be wearing or how long we might have been in that profession. But it is the compassion and the empathy and the ability to connect with other people that allows us to empathize and support each other through things. And that kind of reminded me of something that was said in one of the earlier workshops about accompanying each other as opposed to, leading from the front. I think these are really important conversations that, they kind of sometimes feel somewhat luxurious, in the light of a lot of what goes on in our world, but it is really important as practitioners that we create that space and time, and I think this has been a really insightful opportunity to do that, but to keep making the connections with the other conversations, I think, is really important as well. Somehow we need to kind of try and join them all up together, in a way that makes sense. I wanted to thank you, and I specifically wanted to thank Hannah for sharing that, because I think that is also something about that. The edge can be vulnerable, and we can feel those vulnerabilities, but the strength comes from actually the opening up and the sharing, so that others can feel stronger from it too. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for weaving in pieces from other conversations that are happening in various places in this conference, and that's so much of this kind of cross-pollination of what we're learning and seeing is so much, I think, a part of how resilience is built, right? Is to ensure that these conversations are interconnected and that we're building and layering our knowledge and experiences and these vulnerable learning edges together. So we're coming close to the end of our time together. And so the invitation as we close is for each of us to pop something into the chat here. And the question is just, what's one thing, if anything, you're taking with you from this session? One insight, one reflection, one question. What's one thing you're taking with you from this session?
Okay, thank you so much, Gabrielle. So what I've learned in this session is that our community interdependence is built on both empathy and compassionate. And empathy opens the possibility for a transformative learning for the community members. So if we want to impact our community, both and in order to come up with a transformative learning. Thank you.
And thanks for feeding that back so beautifully and succinctly. That's great. So we have a few others in the chat here. It's good to meander. Further recognition that learning is a mutual process, that even in the structured course context, learning can happen for and with students, tutors, and community members. A reminder to welcome your learning edge and to not shy away from its inherent challenges. Reflecting on a learning edge. Meandering with intent is valuable. Building compassionate communities is a complex process that involves reaching out to others and building a space that is interconnected, vulnerable, and open to learning. I just wrote, what a pleasure it is to be in conversation, even in tiny little boxes. Thank you, everyone. John is asking, thank you, and would like to learn more about the group that Anna noted, the concept of accompanying. And then Olga, thank you so much for chiming in here around what's happening next with parallel session 6. And I think compassion is something we need so much at a time when the dominant discourse is on people as consumers. I feel I want to explore this further. And Jennifer's a final thank you. I'm so glad we were all able to find each other in this 70-minute period together during the conference. Thank you to the incredible team that is making this happen. It just feels great to be so well supported and to feel a sense of connection to Kenya as a place and to the folks running this conference in all of these ways. So thank you, and thank you to all of my colleagues for your time today and for everyone who came. Really a pleasure, and we look forward to connecting in other sessions and beyond this conference. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks for a really good session.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.